everyone. Welcome back to Dad Spinning Politics. This is our, what is it, 39th or 40th
Maybe
episode?
not.
39th episode. Remarkable stuff. If you've been here from the beginning, thank you for sticking with us. If you're just listening for the first time, my name's Frederica. This is Mark Phibbs. Here's my dad. You can probably tell based on the fact we have the same last name. And we're just going to talk a little bit about politics and our experience of it today. So we're going to start with everything that's happening in Indonesia right now, and all the protests that have been going on, civil unrest. Then we're going to talk a bit about the anti-immigration protests that happened in Australia in the past few days and talk about all the effects of that, really, and all that stuff. So let's get into it. Do you want to start off with Indonesia?
Sure. So Indonesia, our nearest neighbor, huge country, people, the largest Muslim country in the world. There was a motorcyclist who was killed in an accident just recently, and that has caused a wave of demonstrations and protests and burnings in many cities around Indonesia. So it's not just the fact that it was seen that the police didn't deal with this correctly and this is an unjustified death through corruption, etc. There's a lot of unrest in Indonesia. A lot of the people feel like they haven't got the benefits of the economic miracle that has been Indonesia over the last number of years. And this is a flashpoint for it, the death of this cyclist. So it'll be fascinating to see whether this unrest continues to grow, or whether the government is able to curtail.
I do have to stop you right there because that wasn't actually the reason for the protests in the first place. The reason for the protests was that there's just like a public announcement, or there was leaked to the public that the lawmakers are receiving an additional allowance on top of their salaries for housing, which is 3,075 like US dollars, which is 10 times the minimum wage in Indonesia. So like you were saying, it's on top of growing unrest in the fact that people are not getting involved in the economic revolution, you could say. But that was the initial pressure point, finding out that information. That's what started the protest. And then following that, at one of the protests, there was a delivery driver just doing his job. He was delivering some food, and in the midst of it, a police car, which was there to control the protest, ran over this obviously innocent civilian, which really plays into the core ideas of the protests themselves, right? Like class, like wage inequality, etc., and not having the right like labor programs for people in Indonesia. When there's protests going on about the minimum wage itself, and someone who is obviously like probably not earning great amounts of money, being an Uber delivery driver, as we've seen in Australia and across the world, and not having great labor benefits, etc. It's almost poetic in a horrific kind of way, I would say. I'm not sure if you would agree with that.
Well, I know I do agree, Freddie, and thank you for the extra detail. It's fantastic.
Mm.
You know, you think about gig economy workers being the lowliest paid in Australia. You can imagine what it's like in Indonesia, right? And so you're right, it's a classic example of this whole issue in Indonesia. Now, the interesting thing will be under former Indonesian governments, they cracked down on unrest with military and all sorts of things. So, and the government is not too old. This government in Indonesia has only been in place for, I think, 10 months or so. Seem to be very liberally minded and want to bring Indonesia forward into the next century as a modern, dynamic country. So it'd be fascinating to see how they handle this, because this will be a real test of the government's morals and their real ability to run the right strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's quite an interesting situation, right? Because I know Indonesia is technically the third biggest democracy in the world, right? As you said before, about 200 million people, has a massive population. And the fact that it is democratic is, a huge win when you think about it in that way, when we're declining democracies across the world. But what does that mean in this situation? Currently, the leader is a retired general. His name is Prabowo. I don't know if
Why
that's
not?
definitely not the right pronunciation at all. But what does that mean that he was a general in the army? What does it mean, his reaction to everything happening now? I know that he's condemned the police killing this innocent delivery driver. as of course he has to be, but there's something going on behind the scenes where these lawmakers are making ridiculous amounts of money on top of the money they're already making. So it really calls into question there's elements of corruption there or what else is happening. And he cancelled a really important trip to China, I believe. That was
Right.
in commemoration. So cancelling that, talking about the UN General Assembly meeting, potentially going to that instead. A lot of stuff is happening. And look, this is just a big reputational scandal for him and for the new government.
Now, just an aside, that China meeting was Xi Jinping was hosting, and Putin was there, the head of India, and so Xi Jinping continues his push to become the leader of the world, given
Mm.
issues with Trump in the US. So it's a real miss for Indonesia not to be there, but understandably, when he's dealing with this local crisis.
I also think, unfortunately, I will stop you quickly. I think that there's potentially two meetings, and that maybe he was meant to go to that one and the other one, and he cancelled both of them, just so you know, because he's not technically part of the Shanghai. There's like the Shanghai Cooperation
Hmm?
Group or something, which was headed by China, and that does not include Indonesia as far as I'm
Right.
concerned. So I think that the meeting was just between Indonesia, India and China. But you're right, you're right. This is another sign that Xi Jinping is, moving up in the world, and that if India and China are prepared to stand against the US together and support each other in the state of the world right now, and Indonesia's not making the most of their relationship with China, then that's probably a bad thing.
Agreed, agreed. And
Yeah.
the Indonesia situation has real implications for Australia. And a big thank you, shout out to Howard Digby, who's one of our listeners. He suggested we should look at Indonesia, and he was telling me that he met Wayne Swan, the former minister in a former Labor government, some time ago, and asked the question, which country is he most concerned about this diplomatically, and put the major focus on. And he quickly said Indonesia. All right.
Mm,
Australia's neighbour, and it's a huge democracy, as you were pointing out. So
yeah.
this has Australian implications if it's not brought under control in the right way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we underestimate it a lot, as Australia always tends to do. We overlook these massive countries and economies that exist so close to us and could be benefiting us a great deal, but instead we look farther afield to find our allies. And maybe it's a new era, maybe it's a time to look towards our closer regional partners instead. But
Indeed.
yeah, no, it was a great suggestion from Howard Digby, your friend. It's wonderful. But yeah, I'm not sure. Do you have any other comments to make on that?
No, let's move on to the immigration protests in Australia that happened
Mm-hmm.
weekend. It's been a big time in all the mainstream media over the last few days or so. So for
Yeah.
those listeners who aren't up to date, there was Advance Australia protests, i.e. anti-immigration protests in several major cities throughout the country. Not huge numbers of people, like in the realms of 5,000 or that sort of thing. Nothing like the Recognising Palestine protests,
March for Humanity
March
protest.
for Humanity protests, which, be 100,000 people, etc. But still,
Mm.
it's unusual for Australia to have an organised body that's looking at this. Now, many people say, oh, they're doing it because of the cost of living and the lack of housing and blaming immigrants for that. I don't buy that, but we can have a discussion around that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And I think I'll just say before we dive into the reasons and the effects of such a protest, that there are some interesting correlations that have been pointed out by people, right? The fact that the March for Humanity protest that you got to attend only a few weeks ago was so incredibly massive and a statement to all of Australia for what we represent. And it seems like this March for Australia protest, which when you hear it, you think March for Australia, what a beautiful thing. Why would I not want to take part in something like that? But then you hear the reality of what it is, and it's a bunch of neo-Nazis supported by regular Australians who are potentially fed up with the situation or feel like they're not being heard and want their chance to walk across the harbour bridge. I even heard this ridiculous thing that Barnaby Joyce was saying. I mean, shock horror, Barnaby Joyce was saying something ridiculous, but he was saying that in the March for Humanity protests that you participated in, he said that everyone was walking across the bridge waving ISIS and Taliban banners. And he said that why not have a march where you can walk across like waving the Australian flag. It was something like that. But just like how shockingly ignorant he is to not understand what the March for Humanity was about. And it wasn't simply complaining about something. It wasn't pro-Hamas individuals. It was just pro-humanity. That's why it was called that. And then this is simply just a few people who are fed up, obviously have too much time on their hands if they can take a full day off work and walk across the harbour bridge rallying for
But
whatever it is.
it is Sunday, so people weren't working, right?
Oh, that's true. Well, that's true. But some people are working on Sundays.
Really, I wouldn't count it as people are following the neo-Nazis. The neo-Nazis turned up. I mean, you've got to give people credit. Some people might have gone there because the narrative is we've got all this inflation, we've got all this pressure on housing, we've got all this pressure on jobs, etc., because we have too many immigrants. That's their narrative, okay? Now, nothing could be further from the truth, in fact. We have very low unemployment in this country
Hmm.
even with the immigration we've had. Immigration economically drives more economic growth, therefore creates more jobs, right? You still have the housing issue, but the housing issue, if we had no immigration, would still be an issue
Mm.
because there's fundamental challenges with the economy in terms of providing more supply. And we can get into that. That's all about the tax policy and the cost of building and too much regulation, and that whole thing needs to be deregulated. And, inflation's too high. Inflation's coming down. So you see, what I find frustrating is these protests come from a point of view of people being uninformed about the real situation. And they use immigration as the silver bullet to say, oh, too much immigration's causing all this. If we stop that, everything would be great.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I wasn't sure that you'd finished your spiel. But yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think it is important to just lay out the facts on that and lay out the fact that Australia has focused for a long time on just expanding urban centres. So pushing to the edges of Sydney and building further out rather than focusing on building housing within the city and in the urban center to point of what's going on, because that's where we need housing, right? So there's a whole number of issues which have caused this. We're not going to get into the housing crisis right now and identify all the factors that have caused it. But yeah, obviously there's a certain irony in an anti-immigration march being completely walked by people who are part of white Australia, who obviously immigrated to Australia at some point or other. That it's a bit ironic, you have
Now,
to say.
the funny moment of this was that you shared with me, Freddie, that after the protest, quite a few protesters or one group went for yum cha lunch after the protest, which I
Mm.
hilarious, right? Here you're protesting against this multicultural society that is Australia, and then you're having a yum cha lunch. I mean, this is just ironic. I mean, people should be just having meat and two veg if they don't want any immigration in this country.
I mean, but that's not even that. I agree with you, but it's a picture of immigration in the way that still white Australians sitting in a yum cha restaurant, everyone there is an immigrant. The white Australians are immigrants. I
Hmm.
think this, like, we need to keep repeating this to people because apparently it doesn't get stuck in their brains. Who are they to say that they can control who is immigrating
But
into their
but I
country
do
or other?
But Freddie, I do think the government needs to take this seriously because a bit like the Make America Great Again, clearly there's a group of people in this country feeling disaffected and not sharing in the benefits, economic benefits. And I think this is how it expresses itself. So for me, there does need to be reform of housing policy and tax policy to help
Yeah.
younger generations. That's what we discussed after the productivity summit. I actually think both leaders of both parties need to come out and say, we've reduced immigration, but a level of immigration is still really important and good for the economy. So, that's really important that people know that and tell the economic argument. Yes, so that'll be interesting how the politicians communicate this to the populace and the benefits of immigration because, Labor has really matched somewhat what the coalition was doing in reducing immigration because of the political
Mm.
issues with this. So they've sort of reduced the level of immigration as it is. And it'll be interesting how they react to this whole scenario.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's unfortunate, obviously, that we have this housing issue and Labour needs to get its act together because otherwise it's a perfect opportunity for these far right groups to use housing as an excuse for their racism, right? But if you fix the problem, what are they going to be rallying about at their protest? If they're happy and their cost of living isn't rising too badly, then they wouldn't be there blaming immigrants for all the issues that they're having.
And to Barnaby's point that he made, that you were discussing about Barnaby, the problem with the people using the Australian flag since the Cronulla riots, however long they were ago, 20 years ago, the use of Australian flag in protest has become somewhat of a racist symbol, which is tragic, right? Because our flags become somewhat related to that. Now, people don't often discuss that, but that's an issue depending on how it's used. And people shroud themselves in the nationality of the Australian flag
Mm.
and to really cover up themselves being racist and say it's in the national interest.
I mean, you're opening a whole can of worms here, though, because then we get into sovereignty and then we get into the notion of Australia becoming a republic as well. Because I mean, I don't personally believe that the Australian flag that we have is representative of Australia as a country. And I think that as I've been growing up, whenever I've seen it used is on days like Australia Day, when there's a bunch of, I have experienced in my circle a bunch of privileged young people who don't understand the experience of Indigenous Australians or even just normal immigrants in the country going around having a ball, wearing the flag, but not understanding the importance of Invasion Day or what it means for Australia as a country. So look, I know that you're saying that it's turning the Australian flag into something uglier than it is, but I already think it represents an ugly reality of Australian life.
I think only in a small minority of the country, to your point. I don't think majority of people feel that way about it. I get that that minority does, but not.
I'm not saying I'm saying that's what it is. I'm saying that like it does represent the fact that
No, I
we are
get
part of
that.
the
I get that.
Commonwealth.
The majority of the population is not that concerned about that.
No, I understand that, but I'm just saying that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah. In your opinion.
Yeah, in my opinion, in my educated opinion, I could disagree with half of the things you say on here and say that like only a few people believe that if I wanted to.
Anyway, it'll be interesting how the media plays this out over the coming days, and hopefully
Mm,
it settles down. I think Susan Ley was criticizing the whole thing, which is really good, the head of the opposition, right? And again, Pauline Hanson has her day in the sun because she can relate to that. I don't know what percentage of the population is, 5 or 10%, but I think majority of Australians are generally in favour of immigration, so long as the government does this job properly in terms of housing
mm,
policy and tax policy, etc., and to reduce the numbers. You know, now you see the impact of that. The universities are sacking lecturers like crazy, including yours at ANU, because they're trying to reduce the deficits they have because they have far
mm,
less international students. So that's very damaging to Australia. And part of that is because we had, joke of course, some courses were jokes that people were coming here to do, and it was somewhat corrupt. The courses need to be valuable, proper university courses. There was all sorts of education suppliers, and the government's cracking down on that. So, but for legitimate courses, there should be no limit, in my view, to the number of international students who can pay and come here to do that, because that is so beneficial for Australia long term, them getting to like the country, relating to the country, and they go back to their own country in the future and they have a positive impression of our nation.
Look, I would also beg to differ that this narrative is probably coming from the same people who were at the anti-immigration protest the other day. I mean, who cares about like a couple thousand people who come here to do a bit of a joke course just in order to stay in the country for a few years? I mean, I know that maybe it seems like a big issue to some people, but there's not a million, like foreign nationals coming in to do these courses, maybe a small number of them. But I think most people are here to really go to university.
And they're paying to do it, so they want to get a return, right?
Exactly. So Australia's still benefiting from it regardless. The universities are benefiting. Our services sector is the biggest thing that we depend on really
Of
for
course. And
economic growth at this point.
the tragedy is Australia is a good leading player in the international education services market, but it's a competitive market. So when Australia makes it harder, they go to the UK or they go to Singapore or they go to the US or Canada or wherever. So it's a
Yeah. No, definitely. And I mean, it's an interesting thing as well because like we're talking about massive decreases in immigration, but I guess compared to COVID, when obviously the number was at zero, people feel like there has been an increase simply because it is returning to regular levels that we had prior to COVID. People believe that something has changed when it really hasn't.
Yep.
It's just gone back to, because I think that the numbers for last year was, I have a number here, overseas migration, which is the number that you talk about when you're talking about foreign students, etc., and migrant workers, was 340,000 individuals in the last calendar year. So it's not in the millions. It's rather small when you think about it. There was previous predictions that Australian population be at 50 million by 2050, but it doesn't seem like it's going to hit that at this point. So it's just about the reality of the numbers and the growth and how it's really affecting our productivity and maybe turn back to productivity.
Well, Freddie, lovely chatting with you. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, listeners, and we'll see you next week for Dad's Planning Politics.
Sounds great.
Bye.